Hello everyone, this is Shivesh Singh from the Literary Odyssey, and what follows is one of our recorded lectures. In our lectures, we go into a lot of detail to help you understand literature and paper one concepts properly and deeply. If you want to learn all the major topics in both the papers from us, consider purchasing our recorded lectures. Right now, they're only 1999 and you'll get access to June 2026 attempt. This is an early bird discount and soon the price is going to increase. So if you're someone who could not join our program or are interested in our approach, please consider buying from the link in the description. And now, off to the lecture. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this lecture. Today, we are going to discuss major trends of literary theory. Now, what you are going to learn here is going to be very important for your literature journey because you'll learn where these ideas come from, why they are important, how they differ from each other. In the previous two lectures, we talked about major genres, we talked about literary history, but this one, I believe, is one of the most fundamental things that you need to know. So we'll start. Now, the origins of textual analysis. When we say textual analysis, which means basically reading a work of literature to figure out the deeper meanings. What does this symbol mean? What does this word mean here? What does this metaphor imply? This kind of textual analysis originates in magic. So you could say that students of literature are descendants of people who did magic. So in a way, you are from the family of magicians if you're a student of literature. Let me explain why. So oracles were people who could see future and would foretell future. So what they did was they would decode the way we decode a poem or the way we decode a work of a novel or any literary work. They would decode divine messages. Now these divine messages could be a dream, it could be a prophecy, it could be all sorts of things, right? So they would decode them exactly the way you decode a poem to look at what this could mean, right? So they would do a textual analysis. They will see if this is allegorical. They will see if there is a major symbol here, and so on, right? So this is where it starts with magic in the earliest of civilizations. Later, it becomes associated with religion. With religion, basically, earlier texts. Now, even in India, we had people who were studying the Veds. Similarly, in the Western world, so most of our lectures focus on the Western civilization because this is literatures in English and the roots of literature in English is in the Western world. So they would interpret sacred works like the Bible and the Quran to understand what does this thing mean. So for oracles, reading divine messages meant figuring out what is the right thing to do. Will there be rain today? Will there be rain this year? Will we win this war? Should we do this as society? So they had a practical reason. So it was pragmatic. In religious texts, you read to find out moral truths and to find out metaphysical truths about the world. Is this moral? Is this a moral thing to do? Does God approve of this? What does this particular line imply about our place in the universe in a religious text? Then we have this continuation in the legal world. So once law becomes codified, people will start studying the law. That how can this particular word be interpreted to fit this particular case? That this is how law works. So the roots of textual analysis, which all of the literature students do, is not in literature. So that's not what people were responding to, right? So when you are in the audience of a Homeric recitation of the Iliad, you won't sit down and do a textual analysis. Maybe you will talk about it, but a close textual analysis is not exactly possible, right? Because it's a narrative. It's a song which is sung to you. So the earliest texts which we read closely are these magical, religious, and legal texts. The word hermeneutics is very important. So hermeneutics basically is the methodology and theory of interpretation. Basically, the idea of interpreting a text is hermeneutics. Right? It origins in biblical scholarship. So basically, the scholars who are working on the Bible were doing hermeneutics. Right? So this word becomes very important in later literary theories as well. So again, oracles and people who were doing magic were trying to do textual analysis to understand what is the right thing to do, what the future would be for practical reasons. Religious hermeneutics was basically to figure out what is life, what is the purpose of life, maybe what is the right way of conduct. So they were trying to figure out an ethics. Legal texts were figuring out, quite literally, how to solve a legal matter. So all of these examples or roots of textual analysis are very pragmatic. Like there is a practical kind of a wisdom that you want to get from your textual analysis. But what practical wisdom do you get when you sit down and read Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats and spend 2 hours studying that poem? No practical wisdom, really, right? You just what you get is a sense of beauty. So this interpretation or textual analysis for the sake of entertainment and beauty is something that we see in literature uh, for the first time, I think. So, textual analysis starts pragmatically and eventually we do it for fun, right? So, you could say that there are pragmatic things or pragmatic aspects to reading literature. Like, I'm reading this novel to learn about life. All of that is true, but at the end of the day, you want to have fun, right? Studying the Bible is not necessarily fun. It could be fun for a lot of people, but they were not doing it for fun. They were doing it as a very important social activity. Same with legal and oracles. So, in literature, we have reading for reading's sake, right? Now, these are 4 major approaches to textual interpretation or literary interpretation. First is text oriented. So, these approaches include everything that looks at the materiality of the text. That doesn't mean the physical nature of the text, but the things, the words on the page, right? So, they will focus on language, style, and formal structure, as you can see on the presentation. These are the text oriented approaches. Then there are author oriented approaches. Author oriented approaches look at the life of the author and try to relate it to the work. So, your psychological approaches would be included in this. Then there are reader oriented approaches, which focus on how the theories influence or affect the reader. Once again. And after reader centric approaches, we have after reader oriented approaches, we have context oriented approaches. Context oriented approaches look at the historical, social, and political context of a work. So, when you do a feminist reading, you're doing a context oriented approach. When you're reading the effects of a poem on your mind, you're doing a reader oriented approach. If you look at the life of a poet to try to understand their poetry, you're doing an author oriented approach. And when you read a text to analyze the style, to see how it means what it means and how the metaphors work and what is the rhyming scheme and so on, it's a text oriented approach. Now let's look at them in more detail, and we'll also look at some examples, right? So that's going to be very important. Now, text oriented approaches are primarily concerned with the internal aspects of a literary work. So what is in the text per se? So you don't look outside the text. Outside the text is the author, is the social social context, and the reader. So they look at what's in the text, right? So it very often includes a close textual analysis. So you look at the text, you read it properly and maybe multiple times, right? And again, it begins with religious and legal interpretations. So when I'm reading the Bible, I don't think what the God thought, right? I'm not looking at the word of the God as what the word God or the witnesses were thinking. When I read the Constitution, I don't think what the makers of the Constitution were thinking. Instead, I'm looking at what the text says and what can I learn from it. Then there are extra textual factors which are excluded, biography, audience, etc. These are the things which are excluded. We have talked about this to an extent. Now, the first, one of the earliest examples of textual analysis is rhetoric. Rhetoric basically is the art of persuasive speaking, basically the art of persuasion. Rhetoric basically means if I'm a rhetorician, I will try to teach you how you can make your speeches and the things that you say more persuasive. So I could ask you to use examples. So if you are trying to convince someone to maybe vote for you, you use examples of the ways you have helped them. I could ask you to refer to the person in properly, so they feel personally involved. So if you're giving a speech, you'll say, "My friend, do you understand this?" So these kind of things fall under rhetoric, right? So this starts before Aristotle and Socrates. So rhetoric is something that is even more ancient than ancient Greek philosophy. Then there is philology, which basically looks at historical uses of language. So a philologist will study, let's say, the works of Sophocles very deeply and focus on the words that are used, trying to figure out what they meant back then. And you could basically say philology is a very, very close study of ancient texts. Some famous philologists are Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a philosopher, also a Nietzsche, who wrote God is Dead, very controversial, and JRR Tolkien, the writer of Lord of the Rings. They were two philologists. Then there's formalism and structuralism. Structuralism is something we have talked, we are going to talk about on our channel in a separate video as well. So they look at the formal properties of a text, right? Basically, the ways in which language is used, the way in which events are structured, and so on. We'll look at it properly in a second. There's new criticism, which believe in the autonomy of a literary work. Basically, they believed that a poem that is in front of you is all you need to know to read and understand and appreciate that poem. So very often what new critics did was they would look at a poem and they would read it so deeply that they will see everything that is working out. So if there is a paradox there, like this line implies this, and that has a paradox with something that was said earlier, they will find a unity there. How does that paradox add to the meaning of the poem? So essentially, it is a very autonomous work. You don't need to refer to something else. Within the poem, you will find all the things that are important, at least with good poems. Now, one of the issues with new criticism is that it works very good with poetry, but with novels, not so much. That if a new critics focus mostly on poetry. And finally, there is semiotics and deconstruction. These are the theories which build upon structuralism, and we'll look at them in just 1 second. Rhetoric, we have talked about them. Stylistics basically focuses on the idiosyncrasies, basically individual styles of a writer. So let's say if you watch a video of Literary Odyssey, you will look at ki Shivesh, this is how Shivesh talks about things, this is how Dhananjay talks about things. So we have our own idiosyncrasies, the way we talk about things. Right? If you watch, let's say, Big Boss, and you will look at Salman Khan hosting Big Boss, then you look at Shah Rukh Khan hosting Big Boss, and you will see that they do it differently. So every writer also has their own mark. Right? So the rhetoric looked at language in general, that how you make it more persuasive. Stylistics will look at individual strategies that each author uses. So if you're looking at Christopher Marlowe, let's say the author of Dr. Faustus, you could say that one of the important part of Marlowe's style is that very often his characters refer to themselves in third person. Right? So Dr. Faustus will often say, settle thy studies, Faustus. So this is the one of the first lines of Dr. Faustus. So he refers to himself in third person. That's part of the stylistics of Christopher Marlowe. But Shakespeare does not do that a lot. Part of Shakespeare's stylistics is his use of soliloquies, right? Where a character will discover themselves. So we'll look at that in a later lecture. So that was rhetorics and stylistics. Again, these are smaller parts. If you want to study stylistics, I recommend reading the chapter from Peter Barry. Then there are formalism and structuralism. Now, formalism and structuralism are both early 20th century movements. Formalism becomes popular a bit later after it has been done. So formalism is something that was flourishing in Russia, but was translated to English a bit later. It emphasizes, again, like all the text-centered approaches, on the intrinsic aspects of literature. But what it looks at is what makes, this is about formalism in particular, this looks at what makes it literary, like what makes a work of literature different from, say, a newspaper, different from, say, an instruction manual. Right? So they look at how literature creates new worlds, how literature makes the word things that we are already familiar with new. This is called defamiliarization, not to be confused with deep familiarization, which is our principle of study. Right? For structuralism, this looks like basically the way a narrative text or a literary text would present itself following the established structures of literary expression. So folk tales have a certain structure, certain type of character, certain type of events that happen. We are going to look at it in some detail in a second. Right? So they don't look at what is said, right? They look at how it is said. So a formalist will not look at how did this writer talk about, let's say, a stone. That's what they will think about. They won't think about what they said about the stone. They want to look at how they talked about the stone. Did they use a particular kind of metaphor? Did they use a particular type of language? What kind of ornamentations did they use? What was the literariness of this particular author's treatment of a stone. Right? So they don't care what is said, they care how it is said. How was this stone made anew to the reader? So you have seen a stone thousands of times, but maybe a poet says something so beautifully and puts the stone in such an interesting context through his poetic genius that you think about stone in a very different way when you read the poem. So that's what the formalist will look at. Structuralists don't look at very particular things; they look at larger structures. So that makes structuralism a bit soulless, or at least so I feel, because very often what we care about in a text are these particular details and not larger structures. So when I'm reading, let's say, Hamlet, I care about the things that Hamlet is saying, but structuralists don't care a lot about that. They want to just see the underlying structures. How did Hamlet get its meaning? What are the structures that Hamlet follows? We'll look at examples in a later lecture and some abhi. Now, we have talked about dehumanization, literariness already. You can pause and read the slides to get a better idea. Dehumanization basically counteracts the reader's familiarity with everyday language. So, they are going to use the same words sometimes. Sometimes they'll talk about very everyday things in unique ways. A very good example of this is Tristram Shandy's Lawrence Sterne's classic novel, Lives and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. It's an early novel. It's a very interesting novel. Formally and in all the ways, it's a very strange novel indeed. Right, so now you know what a novel is, but it will play with the conventions of the novel. Again, most importantly, the most famous example is that the preface is in the middle of the text. Right, of Tristram Shandy, the preface is in the middle of the text, and if you just browse through the pages of Tristram Shandy, you will feel that this is something different. This is not a normal novel. Lawrence Sterne in this way anticipates the postmodern play with form of the novel. Now, structuralism looks at deep structures. Deep structures, let me give you an example, and we're going to look at a particular example as well. Deep structures would be, let's say you are watching a daily soap, right? A serial that every day, which is associated with women, but of course the whole family very often watches it. So in many serials, you can find an underlying structure which is true for all of them. So let's say we have 10 serials, right? And when we focus on them, we see that every serial has a bahu and a sas, right? A daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law. Now the mother-in-law is cruel and is drunk on her power. And the daughter-in-law is very innocent and very nice, and she's never going to say something bad to her. And this creates a lot of situations. And at the end, maybe through divine intervention, like maybe there's something falls from the hands of a Durga Mata statue, things get better for the bahu. So this is a general deep structure. So this is what will happen. Now the particular details may change. How exactly the mother-in-law tortures the daughter-in-law, how exactly divine intervention happens. It could also be in form of a lawyer coming, maybe in form of the husband coming in. Right? So the individual things may vary, but the deeper structure will not. And that is why I said it's a bit soulless. So if I'm reading 10 novels only to figure out the general structure, then I'm not going to talk about the things that actually appeal to me. Right? This particular dialogue, this particular line, this particular character development, and so on. But again, structuralist is not supposed to be very human. It's a very scientific. Right? They were back then there was a whole trend of trying to be scientific, making literature scientific. So some of the things that fall under structuralism is character typology, basically looking at particular types of characters, which we just did, by the way, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. And there's a limited list always. So if the list is unlimited, that's not structuralist, right? You have to figure out the limited things, the underlying deeper structure. It has to be a simplistic structure. We'll look at Props, Vladimir Prop, this guy's approach a little bit in the next slide. But this is basically what character typology works like. There's myth criticism, which looks at the underlying patterns of myths. Now, if you want to do that, you could think about this in this way. One underlying pattern in myths that we have is that somebody has to leave their kingdom and do a vanvas, right? Spend some time in exile. So Ramji did that, Pandavas did that. So that is one structure that is recurrent in our myths. Similarly, a lot of structures are recurrent in various myths. So there's a particular binary that recurs in mythology according to Claude Lévi-Strauss. That is the raw and the uncooked food. Right? So there are all sorts of structures. In our later structuralist lecture, we'll talk about all of these particular structures and how they are important. On top of that, there is also archetypal criticism, which is driven by the work of Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung was a associate of Sigmund Freud. They are people who started psychology. So, Carl Jung's archetypal criticism believes that there are primordial images of human unconscious. And basically, there are some ideas in our mind which are unconscious, so we are not aware of them, which appear as characters, which appear as events. Right? For example, the mother figure. Mother figure we have in a lot of plays, a lot of stories, a lot of folk myths, because this figure is a part of our brain's structure, underlying unconscious structure. Similarly, the idea of a snake. So there is a snake in the Adam and Eve story, that snake who who tempted Eve, and all sorts of snakes in different stories. The idea that fire could purify, like Sita ji had to do Agni Pariksha. So these kind of ideas he believes come up because of some deeper structures in our mind. Now, I personally am not a big fan of archetypal criticism, but there is a lot to see here. There's a lot of interesting things that Carl Jung has done. But as structuralism develops, we move more towards cultural structures and lesser towards these mythical, natural structures. If you want to think about a structuralist who is currently alive, there are two famous one. Excuse me. Sorry, yeah. So there are two famous ones. First is Jordan Peterson. Oh, 1 second. Something is wrong with my laptop. Just give me exactly 1 second. Yeah, so first is Jordan Peterson, and second is Devdutt Patnaik. Devdutt Patnaik is also a structuralist. He does a structuralist analysis of some of the myths, and Jordan Peterson does structuralist analysis of the Bible and a lot of cultural stories in the Western civilization. Moving on, Vladimir Prop, right, is an example of character typology. So while Vladimir Prop studied a lot of Russian folk tales. So folk tales are these stories that people tell. So these are stories owned by the people. There is no author. It comes out of a culture. Now he identified that there are 31 functions and 7 character functions which exist in these tales. So he studied a lot of tales and he picked out some structures which he found in all of them. 31 functions are basically types of events that happen. I'm going to ask you to read about them yourself. So absentation would be that in the story, something will absent itself from a story, from a situation. So maybe once upon a time, there was a king and he had 2 sons. King went on a hunt and then he did not return for 2 days. So the 3 princes went to look for him. Very simple story, but what is interesting is that the king absented themselves. Right? So these are things that happen. Trickery would be somebody tricks the princes later down the line. Guidance would be that they reach a old woman who then guides them. Right? Victory would be they eventually find their father, and return would be they come back. So these are there are 31 functions. Now what's interesting is that Prop noticed, so he has the functions in a list. Prop noticed that these functions always occur in the same order. So all the 37, a folk tale might only have 3 or let's say 5. Right? So this particular folktale does not have all 31 but only 5. Well, they usually have only a few of them. But the order of those 5 functions will always be the way they are in the larger list. So this was a very important structure to figure out. Right? So 31 functions which are events and 7 character functions. Character functions are the roles that a character plays. A character function does not mean types of characters. Please remember, it's a role that a character plays. So there would be a hero, protagonist, villain, antagonist. There could be a donor who donates something. There would be a helper who helps in some way. So very often, donor and helper could be the same person. So this one character is playing 2 roles. So I donated to you a sword which can cut through darkness. I don't know, which can kill a demon. This is the only sword that can kill that demon. These kind of things happen a lot in folktales. So that makes me a donor. Now, I'm going to teach you how to use that sword. That makes me a helper. So I'm donor and helper, both of them. The princess is very often the reward. So you kill the dragon and you get to marry the princess. Right? So this is what props, functions and characters would like an example of a character typology in structuralism. Now what I want you to focus on here is that 31 functions, 7 characters are a lot. So later theorists reduced this by a lot. We are going to look at that in a lecture dedicated to structuralism. No need to go very deep into this in this general lecture. Now, new criticism, as all of you know, it treats a text as an autonomous object, which I have told you before. It was 30s, 40s, were dominant in 30s, 40s, particularly in England and America. Extrinsic factors like biographies, historical contexts, race, genders are things that they don't care about. And there are two important concepts. There are a lot of important concepts in new criticism, and it's a very small topic. But again, this is a general overview. This is a bird's eye view of the literary theory. So there are two major fallacies. First is the affective fallacy. Affective means emotional effect, right? So when you have affective ethics, we have affective theory. We are talking about emotions. So affective fallacy basically means prioritizing or considering your particular emotional responses to a text as an analytical tool. So if you asked me, if you asked me and you are a new critic, and you asked me to analyze a particular set of us or a particular poem. Let's say you asked me to analyze uh, a poem by William Blake. Let's say you asked me to analyze The Lamp. So when I read Little Lamp, I'll say that I love the way it sounds. Little lamb who made thee, there's down who made thee. I love these nice tiny rhymes. And I feel very soft and warm when I read this poem because there's the poet persona refers to the lamb in a very gentle voice. And I feel very emotionally moved when I read this poem. As a new critic, you would say that's bullshit. I don't care about all of that. This is a fallacy, basically a logical flaw. That when you are analyzing literature and focusing only on your emotions, you are not looking at the poem properly, right? You are looking at your emotional reaction. I did not ask about how you feel. I asked you about to analyze the poem. So they would want me to look at particular aspects. So me being me, I said, oh, I understand. So you don't want my emotions. So when I read this poem, ignoring my emotions, what I see is that what William Blake is trying to say here is that God has done all of these things. God was also called Lamb when he was Jesus Christ. And then they would say, wait, hold on, this is also bullshit. I did not ask you what Blake is trying to do. I'm not asking the intention of Blake. I'm asking you what is there in the poem itself. Right? So, using author's intention, see what the author must have intended as an analytical tool is called an intentional fallacy. So, if I use my emotions to analyze, that's affective fallacy. If I use intentions of the author, it is intentional fallacy. They were given by Wimser and Beardsley. Right? Again, we'll look at these ideas a lot more detail with more examples when we talk about new criticism properly. So the things that they look at is paradox, irony, wordplay. So again, what is there in the text and unified structure, which we have talked about in the general introduction. They try to see how these things interact together to create a unified poetic effect. Now, in structuralism properly, we also need to talk about Ferdinand de Saussure. So Saussure believed in, not believed in, as a linguist, the word they used for the word was the word sign. So every word is a sign, right? A sign, the way there's a traffic sign. A sign has two parts, signifier and signified. Now these two parts cannot be separated, right? So they are same sides of the two sides of the same coin. Right now, we're not going into this in a lot of detail because we're going to post a video. And second, when we talk about structuralism at large, we'll look at these ideas a lot more detail. So signifier is the sound image. Basically, it is the written word and the sound that you hear when somebody says that word. So when I say tree, the sound tree is a signifier, and when I write TREE, the particular image that you see. So this particular image on your screen right now is a signifier. Now, I want you to note here that signifiers are not words, they are impressions. So, suppose my handwriting is very bad and I write tree in such a way that R and ER merge together. But you can still tell that I've written tree. So, the way the word looks actually has nothing to do with the signifier tree, right? Your brain has an idea of the signifier already, right? So, if I say tree in a different way, if I say tree, if I say tree, if I say tea, tari or something, the physical property of the sound is changing. So I'm saying tree, that's a softer way. I say tree, that's a loud, harsher way. I say tree. Here the emphasis is different in t and re. So the physical qualities of the sounds are changing, but in your brain you're registering the same word, tree. So the signifier is that what you register, right? It's the mental impression of the sound or the image that you see. So the picture of the word which you see here. So that's why we say signifier is a sound image. Signified is the general concept that is related to that sound image. So when I say tree, you think of something with branches, with a trunk, with leaves. You don't think of a particular tree in the world. Right? So signifier is an abstract concept which is related to the signified. Now, one thing to note here is that signifier is a mental impression. Signified is an abstract concept. So nothing in a sign really is from the actual world. A sign exists on its own. Now, according to him, signifier and signified are arbitrarily related. So there is no reason why we call why we call a thing with branches and a trunk and root and leaves a tree. Because in Hindi we call it vriksh, right? Similarly, an animal that barks and is man's best friend is called dog in English and kutta in Hindi. We have no reason to use the word dog and kutta. It is random. It is a social convention that this particular signifier has dissignified. Another example would be I'm called Shivesh, right? But I could be called someone else. I could be called Himesh. I could be called Jivesh. I could be called anything, right? So the signifier and signified are arbitrarily related. My name has nothing to do with me. It's a convention that is imposed upon me since I was born. Now, according to Saussure, meaning arises through a system of differences. This is a bit complicated. And in this introductory lecture, we are not going to look at it in a lot of detail, but we are going to look at it in some detail. So if I ask you to define the word modern, pause right now and try to define it. I hope you tried. Now, you probably said modern is, you related it to literature, and you said modern is this experimental mode of writing literature. Maybe you related it to fashion. You said modern is someone who wears clothes which are more freeing, which are more uh, less restrictive, and so on. So you define modern based on different contexts, right? So in fashion, modern is that which is not traditional, like a sari. In literature, modern is that which is not medieval, right? Like, so basically, when we talk about Shakespeare, he's part of the modern English literature. It's not modernism, but it's modern literature. So there is old literature, medieval literature, modern literature, right? In philosophy, if it is not scholasticism, basically the Christian philosophy, then we call it modern. So every philosophy that starts with Descartes, basically, which does not talk about Bible, but talks about the world in general, about the individual, is called modern philosophy. So we define the word modern by first differentiating it from what it is not. So in clothing, modern is not traditional. Modern in philosophy is not scholastic or medieval. In literature as well, modern is not medieval, right? So we define the modern by what it differs from. This example is, by the way, from a post-structuralism, a very short introduction. So these books are very important to understand basics. Now there is more complexities to this idea of system of differences, which we are going to look at in a later lecture. And but that's basically what it means. That we know the meaning of things based on differences, based on how they differ from each other. The other nuances will be covered in a YouTube video which is coming out very soon. I think by the time you watch it, it will already be out. And in our structuralism lecture, which we'll have once we are done with the history of literature. After structuralism, we have post-structuralism, which basically built on structuralism and semiotics. Now, semiotics is a recent trend. Recent, of course, is a relatively relative word. So, recent is about 60s and 70s. It's recent compared to Homer, but it's not recent compared to Avengers Endgame, right? Which looks at this text as a system of signs, basically these signs, signifiers and signifieds. No, but it does not only look at semiotics, does not only look at signs, it looks at text, but it looks at the world at large as a system of signs, right? So instead of, whereas Saussure's structuralism focused only on verbal things, the words that I speak and words that I write, semiotic extends it to non-textual and non-linguistic signs. So instead of words, it will look at colors. So a semiotician could look at how red, green, and yellow lights are signifiers of stop, go, and wait, right? So they could look at other things to tell you what it means. Let me give you an example. So this is a book, right? You know, the a structuralist could look at a semiotician could look at the elements of this book. It is white. One thing is white, so that could imply that it has ideas which are good, right? So if there's a novel which is about very dark ideas, like let's say there's a collection of the cosmic horror stories of Lovecraft, it will probably have a darker color, right? Similarly, if you look at a snack which is supposed to be healthy, it will probably have green color on its wrapper. So green is a signifier of healthy. Green is not a word here; it's a literal color. Similarly, white is not a written here; it is a literal color. So semioticians look at these things. A very famous example is Roland Barthes. He is the most important semiotician that we are going to study. On top of that, there is Umberto Eco, but right now we are not going to talk about that. Roland Barthes looked at the cover of a magazine where there was a black soldier saluting the French flag. And he said this means essentially that a good black person not only respects the French flag, but he can respect the French flag because French respects its black citizens, which of course was not true. French was a colonial power just like England. And by presenting a black person on the magazine cover instead of a white, they were trying to give you this subliminal message that France and the black people of France have a good relationship. And this is what a good black person looks like. Right? And he reads fashion, of course, as a system of science, how different clothes can say different things. For example, if I have a big chashma, you might think I'm very pataku. If I put on kala chashma, you might think that I'm trying to be very cool. So this is a signifier of being pataku or being very cool. Right? So everything is a signifier essentially for the semioticians. This is a famous image by Rene Magritte called Treachery of Images. So the text here says this is not a pipe. So this is essentially what structuralist insight is, that when I say the word cat, it doesn't refer to a cat, it refers to the idea of a cat. And more thing, this is a very useful pedagogical tool. Pedagogical means teaching related tool. Now this is not a pipe because there is a picture of a pipe. So when we mistake signs for the things that they represent, which is very easy to do, because Abhi, when I said this is not a pipe, you'd be like, of course there's a pipe. But no, it is a picture of a pipe. In fact, it is a picture of a pipe which you are seeing as pixels on your screen. So this is not a pipe at all. But very often we mix the signifier, the sign, and the actual thing in the world. This is an example of that. Now, post-structuralism, the most important idea in post-structuralism, and post-structuralism basically starts with the work of Jacques Derrida. Derrida talks about a few things. Most important, deconstruction, which is a way of reading a text. He introduced the concept of difference, right? In French is différence, something along those lines. I don't speak French, but in English we call it difference with an A. So in the English spelling of difference, you'll have E here instead of A, DIFFERENCE. But there's a difference. He adds A to add another meaning. So according to Saussure, the meaning of modern was not traditional. But according to Derrida, when we start defining modern like this, modern is that which is not traditional, which brings us to question what is traditional. And then traditional is that which is not ancient, let's say. I don't know, not modern would create a circle, right? The best example is to look at a dictionary. What is a laptop? Laptop is a device which has some keys on it or some buttons and a screen, and it folds. Wait, but what is a device? A device is a piece of machinery which is used for some work. Wait, what is machinery? Machinery is and so on. So to know the meaning of one word, you need to know the meaning of other words. Right? To know the meaning of laptop, you need to know the meaning of device. To know the meaning of device, you need to know the meaning of machinery and so on. So meaning is not only through difference, that modern is not what is traditional, but it is also postponed. So to know the meaning of modern, you need to know the meaning of traditional. Maybe to know the meaning of traditional, you need to know the meaning of culture. To know the meaning of culture, maybe you need to know the meaning of civilization and so on. So meaning is postponed. You never reach an end point. This postponement is called deferral. Basically, to defer something. We will do that later. So meaning is both differential and differential. So that's difference. I understand if it's a bit complicated right now, but right now we just need to know that these things exist. Right? In our particular lecture, we look at how they exist and how they are very important. But we're still going to look at an example. So this is a sonnet by William Shakespeare, very famous, sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling birds of May. At summer's lease hath all too short a date, and so on. So what happens? What happens in this sonnet is the poet says that should I compare you to a summer's day? So this was a convention back then. Everyone would. So this is a Europe, right? So summers are very good. In Delhi, where I live, summers are horrid. So if somebody compares me to a summer's day, I'll be like, hey, come on, man, why would you do that to me? And I'm nothing like the summer. Because it's very annoying. Summer is very annoying. Maybe I am like the summer. But yeah, say I compare it to a summer's day. Summer is a very pleasant time in Europe, most of Europe. So when I say shall I compare it to a summer's day, I'm trying to give a compliment, right? Not so in Delhi. She says, but you are more lovely and more temperate than summer. And sometimes winds are too strong. Sometimes summer does not last very long. Sometimes the sun is too bright, right? So all of these are issues with the summer, but those are not issues with you, right? Your summer, unlike the summer of the real world, which only lasts a season, will never fade, right? Your eternal summer will never fade. So you are not, I can't compare you to a summer because you're better than summer and you are eternal. Now the issue here is, the deconstructive insight here is, at first it looks like he's trying to compliment the reader, the object of the poem, right? The person, the beloved. But if you read it again, okay, so summer has all of these issues, but you also said that my eternal summer. So you are trying to say that summer has all of these issues and my summer is eternal. So my issues will never die, right? That is one way of looking at it. Now, in the end, he says, your summer will never fade because I'm writing this poem. So because I'm writing this poem, people will read it and they will think about your beauty. So here again, there's a deconstructive insight. That, okay, so he is better than summer's day, the beloved, because a lot of the sonnets are dedicated to a man, we believe. He's better than the summer's day because of all of these reasons, because summer is temporary, because summer is sometimes not perfect. But your summer will not fade and you are better in this poem, right? If I don't write this poem, your summer will fade and your beauty is not perfect. Your beauty also has blemishes. So essentially what this is trying to say is, you are just like the summer. You are temporary, you have issues, but in this sonnet you are more. Right? So this sonnet has two arguments. One, you are better than the summer, and two, you are just like the summer unless I write this poem. So these two arguments, which are counter to each other, that the text are used both for something and against something, is how deconstruction works. So both the readings are very valid readings, right? You are beautiful. I'm capturing your perfect beauty in this sonnet, so everybody will know it. Other would be, because I'm capturing your beauty in this way, your beauty is perfect and it will never fail, right? So they're contrary readings and both are true of the text. Why are both of them true? Because language is complicated. That's basically the whole idea. Language is slippery. You never have hold on it. This is a very basic example, again from the same book which I mentioned earlier. When we talk about deconstruction properly, we are going to look at more technical examples, which will be a lot more complicated, but which will help you understand how deconstruction works properly. We'll look at how the logic of supplement works. It's a very important word for Derrida. We'll look at what aporia is like. Now, a little bit of aporia, you can see that there is a paradox here, that both things are being talked about, but there are a lot more aspects to this. Right, so this is an example of deconstructive reading. More examples you can find in that. In Peter Barry, there's a very good example of deconstruction at the end. So deconstruction is not as mystical as it looks like when we talk about it, because again, the French literary theory has a very complicated jargon to it. In our later lectures, when we cover deconstruction properly, it will make more sense. It will be a little intuitive, and you won't be afraid of Derrida and Foucault and Lacan as much. So those were text-oriented approaches, right? Again, we are looking at we did not think about Shakespeare a lot. We looked at just what is said in the text. After text-oriented approaches, we have author-oriented approaches. The author-oriented approaches look at biographical ideas and try to establish a direct link between the text and the author. Now, you could say that why are we doing this again, right? Because of the intention fallacy. Why do we care about it? Why do we care about it? Is a very interesting idea in literature. What did I say earlier? That the roots of textual analysis is in magic, religion, and law. And these are practical reasons. We don't do literature for practical reasons, right? If we do everything only for practical reason, life would not be worth living. We do this because it's interesting. We learn interesting things about the world. Now, Henry James said this, by the way, that only demand he has of a novelist is that his novel be interesting. He does not care about morality. He does not care about realism or truth or something. He just wants the novel to be interesting. And I believe in this idea very, very fully. You could also, to an extent, agree with me. Of course, political things are there. But at the end of the day, when we study literature and we do literature, we have to be interesting. Now, interesting could have multiple definitions. But that is perhaps the basic most important thing that is should be there. So we do biographical criticism because it can give us interesting insights which are meaningful to understand the world and ourselves. And this is an example I really love. So Mary Shelley, the writer of Frankenstein. So what happens in Frankenstein? I'll give you a basic idea. There's a guy. He's not a scientist. He's just a guy who studied life and how life comes into being, and he wanted to create life. Right, so he takes up a lot of the dead body parts from a graveyard, stitches them together, and brings that thing back to life. Now, the guy who did this was called Victor Frankenstein, and the being that he made by stitching together these dead body parts is called Frankenstein's monster. Alright, this is what the story is basically about. Now, we can talk about a lot of things. We could talk about the fall of human. We can talk about life. We can talk about all sorts of things when we read Frankenstein. We can talk about advancements in science and all sort of things. But one interesting thing is that around the time she was writing Frankenstein, Mary Shelley had a miscarriage, that she lost a baby. Why is this interesting? Maybe at the time, now this was industrialism was very big back then. Science was making a lot of progress. Maybe Mary Shelley thought that there is a way to bring the child back. Maybe Mary Shelley was occupied the ideas of what is life. Is life something we can give to someone? Like, because she was going to give life to someone and she could not because there was a miscarriage. There's an interesting insight. And that is enough for it. Right? It does not need to justify it to the world. Why is this possible? Right? Not everything is for the market. I like this. This is a reading of Frankenstein which I find a lot more interesting than those romantic and more contextual readings. Right? Now, there's also phenomenology. Phenomenology is basically how things appear to our mind, how phenomena appear to our mind. So, what they're trying to basically say is when you read the work of an author, you can also get a sense of their spirit. Right? We'll talk about that later. Spirit is a very important word in phenomenology. Now, of course, psychology is a very important thing when it comes to author-centered approaches, because authors have minds. Minds are follow psychology, whatever. Psychology studies mind. It was, of course, influenced by the first psychoanalyst, Sigmund Freud. So a Freudian reading basically looks at a text and tries to understand what the author may have unintentionally said in the text. So what unconscious ideas about the author's own identity can we find there? The absolutely most famous one is Hamlet. So there is something called Oedipus complex. We are not going into detail. It basically says that every baby, particularly baby boy, when they are born, they are sexually attracted to their mothers, and that is why they are jealous of their fathers. And there is a desire in them to kill their father and marry their mother. Now, as they grow up, that desire is suppressed, and it becomes a desire for other women. And that idea of killing their father is also suppressed, and it becomes the idea of identifying with your father. So you become like your father, looking for someone, a woman who could be like your mother. Of course, there is not a lot of scientific basis to it, but it is an interesting idea nonetheless. So in Hamlet, you must know the basic story. Hamlet's uncle killed his father, King Hamlet, same name, and married his mother, Gertrude. So people believe that the reason Hamlet could not kill Claudius, now this is part of the problem of the play, that Hamlet is not able to avenge his father's death from his uncle, is because his uncle has done the same thing that he wanted to do as a child, which was kill the father and marry the mother. And that is why he cannot take an action against this moral thing, because he understands Weird thing to say, but he understands. That's so. This is how it looks. So maybe uh, Shakespeare was Shakespeare has Oedipal feelings which he wanted to express here. So all sorts of things psychoanalytic approaches does. After psychoanalytic approaches, which are part of author-centric approaches, we have reader-oriented approaches. Reader-oriented approaches focus on what the readers feel, right? So the author-oriented approaches were against intentional fallacy, like the intention of the author, which new criticism said is irrelevant. The author-based oriented approaches say it is relevant. Reader-oriented approaches say that even the affective fallacy or affective impressions are relevant, because at the end of the day, if there's a novel that nobody is ever going to read, then this text does not exist, right? Somebody has to read it for the text to come into being. And when I read a text, I'm not reading it in isolation. So but let's say there's a guy called Peter, and I hate Peter. Like there's someone in my life called Peter, and I hate that guy. Absolutely hate. Can't tolerate Peter. And I open a novel and it says, once upon a time, Peter was going to the book club, right? And I'll be like, oh, I hate Peter. Look at him going to the book club. Even though that has nothing to do with the Peter in my life. And so, who I am affects the way I feel about characters, about events, about words. So, the novel, when I read, because I hate Peter a lot, will have a whole different meaning to me. At least it will have a different vibe to me, right? Because I hate Peter. Now, if somebody called Peter reads it, they'll be like, hell yeah, this is my name. There's a novel about a character who has my name. They'll have a lot more positive vibe if the Peter is a good character in the novel. Someone who doesn't care about Peter would feel would have a different response. So every word is registered and interpreted differently for different people who are reading it. Right? That's why text is evolves with every reading process. Let's say I read a novel, right? And in the novel there's a murder, it's a detective fiction that I'm reading, and I'm completely hooked throughout. By the end, when I figure out who the murderer was, I'm completely shocked. I'm like, wow, this was one of the best novels ever. 5 years later, I pick it up again. But this time I'm not shocked that I'm looking at the evidences about the foreshadowing. Okay, I know this is the guy who is going to be the murderer in the end because I read this novel. Let's look at what evidence was there which I missed in the first reading. So basically, I will look at these things and I'll understand, okay, this is how this was done. So my first reading will be different from the second reading because my response to the first reading will be different from my response to the second reading. So both the times, we have slightly different experience of the text, right? Now, this is also called reception theory. So this says that there are some, I think all of this we have discussed. So depending on which society you are from, which ethnic and national groups you are from, your experience of the text will change. So let's say I'm from country A, which hates country B, and I read a novel about a guy from country B. So maybe I'll be a bit more suspect. I'll suspect this person. Yeah, this guy is going to do something bad. And so my national identity changes the way I read a novel. My social identity changes it as well, and that's why we look at now uh, that a lot of the women, when they read a text which is old, very old, which the male-dominated academy said this is a great text, when the women read them, they saw that, wait, this text is very sexist. This has a lot of issues. That's something that the men did not see because they're different social group, right? Now, the role of the reader is very important, of course. So there's a guy called Wolfgang Iser, who is very important for reader response theory. He says that every text has some blanks which are filled by the reader. We're going to look at this in a second with an example. And these blanks are filled by different readers in different ways. Every blank and every sentence that you read creates some expectations, and those expectations are either fulfilled or not fulfilled. So when I come across Peter from country B, I want like, okay, so this guy is going to suck, and I hope he dies in the novel. But none of those things happen. So that will change the way I feel about that text, right? So that will basically change what that text is. So it happens at the level of the sentence, and even to an extent at the level of the words. So let's try. I'm going to read a line. This is this is not from any novel. And let's try to think about this. I opened the gate this morning and felt the grass brush against my skins. Now, when I did this with the students of our mentorship program, some people imagined that the narrator is a boy, some people imagined that the narrator is a girl. Right now, we don't know. It depends on you, what your imagination is like. Like, for me, it was a boy. And maybe because I, being a boy, am reading this in my masculine voice, you might think that, okay, it is a boy who's speaking. But if you read it yourself, maybe you relate it more to your gender. And maybe you relate it to the other gender because you have read more novels which feature in the other gender, right? The air was fresh and I carried a notebook tucked under my arm, though I wasn't sure what I wanted to write. Why wasn't this person sure what they wanted to write? Maybe they had a lot of ideas in their mind. Maybe they had no ideas in their mind. So if you are somebody who writes novels, poetry, whatever, depending upon why you struggle to write, you will imagine a different kind of struggle. Now, so this person felt morning grass brush against their ankles and the air was fresh. Are they in a garden or are they in a lawn of their house? Are they in a forest? Are they in the mountains? You don't know. It will change depending upon how your mind thinks about the word fresh air, how your mind thinks about the word grass brushing. So I'm from Delhi, so when I think about fresh air, I think about something that does not exist. What even is fresh air? Right? I think about mountains because when I'm in the mountains, the air actually feels different. And so when you enter Delhi, it starts to stink. As I walked towards the old bench beneath the neem tree, now suddenly things change. So far, we were imagining something. But as I walked towards the old bench beneath the neem tree, suddenly we are in a park, right? Maybe in a garden. But why would there be a branch in the forest? And the neem tree, suddenly we are also in India. Very often, this happens to me, and because that says more about me because I read a lot of Western literature. I have not read as much Indian literature as I should, and I'm embarrassed about that. But suddenly, neem tree evokes the idea that okay, this might be set in India. The whole thing changes. The protagonist's clothes change. The protagonist's appearance change. The whole social context within which you are imagining this thing change. I thought the day might be waiting for me to begin it. How do we read this? Right? So there are gaps, right? It's not mentioned. The gender is not mentioned. That is a gap. Where is the air? What is the setting? All of those gaps are fulfilled and you are filled by you, and you are either satisfied with what happens or dissatisfied. Right? So every time you read a text, a different idea or vibe of the text is created in your mind. Another important thing is reception history. So reception history looks at how a particular text was read across time. My favorite example of this is Shylock. So Shylock is a Jewish character in a play by Shakespeare called Merchant of Venice. Now, Shakespeare's audience never met Jews. There were no Jews in England back then, or if there were very few, right? Because all of the Jews were kicked out. Now, Shakespeare audience never met the Jews. So when I think about them, they will know Jews only through stories. And the stories about Jews in Europe back then were not good stories. Jews are very evil people. So Shakespeare's audience will feel, okay, this guy called Shylock, the Jew, is a very evil guy indeed. But within the text of Shakespeare, there are reasons because of which in the Romantic age, people were sympathizing with the Jew because he was suffering for a lot of things. In the modern age, after the Holocaust, after the horrors of the Second World War, people were uncomfortable with Shylock because we saw how bad Jews were treated in Nazi Germany, and the archetype of an evil Jew was partly responsible for that treatment. So when we see Shakespeare doing that, when we see it on the stage, we feel uncomfortable. Right? So that's the reception history, that this text was read differently by different generations. This historical way of reading a text or studying its reception is called diachronic. Right? Diachronic in linguistics is historical way of studying the evolution of language. Diachronic in reader response is basically historical change in reception. Synchronic is looking at how it is read in a particular time. So a synchronic study would be, let's say, how are college students reading, let's say, Handmaid's Tale. So the students who like watching Andrew Tate are reading Handmaid's Tale in a different way. Students who like watching, Brain Rot are reading Handmaid's Tale different way. Students who have studied more feminist theory are reading Handmaid's Tale differently. Students who are more into technical aspects of literature are reading Handmaid's Tale differently. So these novels are read differently by different people in the same time, right? So that's a synchronic study. Diachronic is across time. Now let's look at context-oriented study approaches. Context-oriented approaches look at the context of a particular literary text, and this is the approach which dominates academia right now, at least in India. Right. So when if you remember your bachelor's or your master's, before you read Hamlet, you had a background lecture. This is what was happening in Elizabethan age. This is what the theaters were like. These were the concerns of the writers writing during the Elizabethan age. These were the political movements. There was gunpowder plot. There was issues of succession and so on. So we contextualize the text in its history. Right. That's a context-oriented approach. Now, in context-oriented approach, we have Marxism, which looks at how a text interacts with the larger socio-political mechanisms. So a Marxist will look at a novel and say, okay, this is a good novel and so on. But what I'm interested in is how the class differences or how the social structure of this text reflects the social structures of its time. So one of my favorite examples of this is Basola. So there's a play called the Duchess of Malfi by John Webster. It's a Jacobean tragedy, which is a character called Basola who's to better his social situation is doing some very evil things. So a Marxist or someone who's interested in these social political systems would look at this play and say, okay, so Basola represents the middle class, which is trying to do anything to rise above their station. Of course, based on the works of Karl Marx. And they focus on the conditions of production, right? So social and the class conditions of the production of a literary text. There's literary history, which we have talked about already, like you look at Elizabethan age and etc. Of course, all of these things interact. Marxism, literary history, Marxist literacy. New historicism is interesting. New historicism looks at the background not as something that is static. So historicism, traditional historicism is, okay, this is what was happening in Elizabethan age. These were the ideas, these were the larger political movements, and this is what Shakespeare wanted to do. And this is how we read, let's say, Twelfth Night, or let's say Macbeth, Hamlet, King Lear, whatever, in this situation. What new historicists do, as opposed to traditional historicists, is that they read history side by side. So they're not going to assume abstract ideas of history. They're going to read history. So there's a play, let's say there's a court jester. Now I want to study the humor of this play. I would think about what the jokes how the jokes relate to the larger thematic concerns of history. I will read historical jokes. Let's say there is a joke that was said by this person in his diary. So I'm reading a random text, right? Instead of, this is not a joke that is relevant to this play that I'm trying to study. But I found a diary entry of a random Elizabethan guy, and I saw, okay, this is the kind of jokes they were making, right? And then I saw a periodical or a newspaper, which there weren't much of. I saw a pamphlet which had a joke. Like, okay, so these are the kind of things that Elizabethans found funny. So I'm not taking the history to be a background. I'm reading history as well, trying to create history to create a vibe of what humor was like in Elizabethan times. I'm trying to understand what the social energy was like. So right now, if you want to look at, let's say 100 years later, somebody opens the vault called 2025 humor, and then they see some brain rot like Bombadillo, Crocodilo. They'll be like, what the hell is this? Why was this funny? The traditional historicist will look at larger ideas. Okay, so by this time humor was becoming a bit absurd. This is what was happening. But a new historicist will put this parallelly to all the other means, parallelly to the discourse around humor, figure out what exactly were the things that we were laughing at in 2025, and then try to contextualize things there. That's what new historicism was like. It did not look at larger themes in the background, but they look at what was actually happening in the time. Right? The most important theorist of new historicism is Stephen Greenblatt. Cultural studies is also very important. So cultural studies looks at the context as it is built by culture at large. We have a wonderful video by Dhananjay on the Gen Z protest which happened in Nepal recently, and he looks at the ideas of Raymond Williams and how they intersect there. I absolutely recommend, do watch it. Now the idea was here that every piece of culture, including advertisements, infomercials, fashion, music, etc., as you can see here, all of them are manifestation of that culture. And in them, we can see these social ideas and social ideologies flowing. Right? So, whereas earlier you look at literature in particular, with new historicism, we give equal importance to literature and historical documents. With cultural studies, we give equal importance to literary and non-literary things. Right? Similarly with semiotics. So, after semiotics, we have one of the most potent context-oriented approaches, which is feminism and gender theory. Most potent because although other movements helped a lot, helped us understand a lot, feminism broke the canon entirely. So, we had new canon, a new set of important literary works. We had a feminist canon. We re-evaluated biggest writers like Shakespeare, Dickens, and etc. Feminism is generally divided into three waves. First wave, which focuses on the legal rights. So first, from late 19th to early 20th century, there were feminisms earlier as well, but right now this is a general consensus basically. The focus was on legal rights. Okay, so women are not equal citizens right now. I want them to have equal rights, right? I want, women wanted women to have equal rights. It's not that men wanted them to have equal rights. So they would fight for women's suffrage. Suffrage means a right to vote. And they demanded equal property rights, access to education. So they were fighting for very fundamental things. In the second wave, they wanted to fight for things which are more cultural. So they were not looking at the constitution, they were looking at how culture is responding. So they want equality in family. Okay, so I have the right to vote because of the first wave feminism, but my husband would not let me go out to vote. Right? So that's not a legal issue, that's a cultural issue, like equality in family, workplace, and society. Ideas like reproductive rights, sexuality, and domestic violence were also taken up here. In third wave of feminism, the whole thing changes. We focus on intersectionality. We realize that a lot of the feminist ideas were not relevant to the black women in America, right? So the feminism of America was for a very long time for middle class white women. Black women were not included. Similarly, a lot of the feminism in India is feminism of urban women, like women who work in offices. So that is not a feminism that directly represents women in villages or women who are of the lower castes, right? The so-called lower castes. So we believed suddenly in the third wave feminism that feminism is not enough. We need to have feminisms, right? We need different ideas to represent different people. And again, as we have gender theory, we go away from, we go away from just focusing on women issues and we focus on gender issues at large. What are the ways in which men are affected? What are the ways in which women are affected? What are the ways in which people of different sexual orientations are affected, and all of those sorts of things. This is more prominent right now. We are still doing this. Every now and then there is research on feminist interpretation of XYZ novels. So this is very prominent. Marxism, feminism are very prominent right now. Context of oriented approaches. Now there's general idea, general timeline of theoretical movements. It starts, as I said, with rhetorics, and it starts with cultural studies and these context oriented approaches. So that is all for today. As I said, we are only taking a bird's eye view of things. We are not trying to go deep into everything. I hope you understand. I hope you had fun. In the next lecture, we are going to pick up the foundations of Western civilization, which will be major epics, some Christian ideas, and of course, after that, we'll start with particular works. Thank you so much.